And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Book TV is in London, interviewing some British authors, and now joining us is James Delingpole, who is the author of several books, and several books with the word watermelons in it. Mr. Delingpole, why do you use the term watermelons?
Watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. It's about the environmental movement. After the Berlin Wall came down, a lot of people on the left were a bit confused about where to go next because capitalism seemed to have won the argument. But what happened with environmentalism, they saw that in the guise of saving the planet, they could advance the causes that they held dear, the causes of the left.
And what were some of those causes?
It's the same as it always has been throughout history. Control, regulation, higher taxes, the creation of a bureaucratic, technocratic elite beyond the democratic control of the ordinary people. Just as we saw in Stalin's Soviet Union, as we saw in Hitler's Germany, I think environmentalism is the new totalitarianism, but with a soft, smiling, polar bear hugging, kindly face.
So what's your opinion of what we call climate change?
Well, as you can imagine, I'm on the skeptical side of the argument, and I'm very happy to say that the science seems increasingly to be with me. Anthropogenic global warming theory was never more than an hypothesis, and like all hypotheses, it's open to test through observation, and it is increasingly failing the test. I think they're going to have to come up with a better theory. Do you consider yourself a conservative, a libertarian? How do you view yourself? Interesting question. I think I used to consider myself as what we call in England a natural conservative. I never went through that stage you're supposed to go through when you're about 17 or 18, where you start becoming a socialist because the world is so unfair and you want to rebel against your parents and so on. I never went through that. It seems to me that the conservative, as Margaret Thatcher once famously said, the facts of life are conservative. But I've undergone a progression not unlike the one undergone by William Cobbett, who was a great English essayist, pamphleteer. He turned slowly in his career from a natural Tory into more of a radical. I consider myself more of a radical now, but I'm libertarian in my philosophy. I believe in small government. I believe in liberty.
And when you use the term radical, how is that different than we use it in the States?
Well, it's a nicely vague word. I think it means that I am railing against the status quo constantly. I don't think that the current systems by which the world is governed are a very good advert for democracy. I think that probably the world is in the biggest economic crisis it has probably ever known, the most intransigent, the longest lasting, the most frightening.
James Delingpole, are you an outlier here in the UK as far as your political views?
Totally. I am the prophet without honour in his own country. I am like Cassandra. I always speak the truth, I predict the future more or less correctly, but I'm doomed to be ignored. Although I've got a much bigger following, I think, in the US and Australia. It's odd. I think people in England think of me as a bit of a freak. Although it has to be said that people are starting to come round to me. Look at the growth of UKIP, the UK Independence Party. It's been doing very well in the recent local elections. I suppose UKIP is the equivalent of our Tea Party. It essentially believes in smaller government, in people's right to self-determination, less regulation, lower taxes, less involvement with the European socialist superstate.
You stood for Parliament at one point, correct?
I nearly stood for Parliament and I withdrew at the last minute. But I have to say, I'm not ruling out future ventures into politics. I never thought of myself as being a politician because I despise politicians. But that, in a way, is the reason why I'm increasingly interested in becoming one, because the people in power are doing such a terrible job. Many of these people were my university contemporaries. I was at Oxford with David Cameron, with members of his cabinet, with the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, and they're not all doing badly, but quite a few of them are, and I reckon I could do a better job.
And were you a single issue person
No.
in your near run?
I was in my near run. I stood as the anti-wind farm candidate. I think that wind farms, wind turbines, are the abomination of our age. But wind farms,
Why?
they're a symbol of the, I call them bat-chomping, bird-slicing eco-crucifixes. And the reason I call them eco-crucifixes is because they serve no real function, no sensible economic function, certainly. Their only real purpose is to symbolize the dominance of the green movement over the world, in the same way that crucifixes, in the same way that, for example, in the Middle Ages, the French Catholic Church subjugated southwest France when they had the Albigensian, the Cathar revolt against Catholicism. They subdued the local insurrections by building cathedrals as a symbol of the dominance of the church. In the same way, wind turbines, they fail on any number of ecological levels. They kill birds, they kill bats, they actually increase carbon emissions, they destroy the environment. And these things are being advocated by people who are supposedly committed to saving nature. So their only purpose is a symbol of the dominance of big green.
James Delingpole, how do wind turbines increase carbon output?
The problem is that because wind energy is intermittent, as you know, wind only blows a certain amount of the time. Probably about no more than a third of the time is the wind blowing enough to power the turbine, which means that you constantly have to have backup supply for when the wind isn't blowing. And guess what provides this backup supply? It's fossil fuel power. Now, even when the wind is blowing, this fossil fuel power has to be kept humming away on what's known as spinning reserve. So even when you've got the wind producing this alleged carbon-free energy, and don't forget, think of all the carbon which goes into making of these turbines, think of all the concrete bases the size of Olympic swimming pools, think of the rare earth minerals mined in under appalling environmental conditions in China. But let's accept for a moment that wind is carbon neutral. Even then, you have to have fossil fuel powered stations humming away on spinning reserve producing carbon. So it doesn't work.
Mr. Delingpole, you mentioned that you went to Oxford with David Cameron, with Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
In the U.S., we often look at large universities and say, oh, liberal professors, etc. Is that the case here in the U.K. as well?
I think that almost all the seats of academe have been hijacked by the liberal left to a greater or lesser extent. Oxford, I was never aware of the politics of my dons at the time. Dons is what we call professors, yeah. It certainly never affected my politics. When I was at Oxford, it was at the time we had a conservative government. They were fighting the miners' strike. So it was very fashionable to be left-wing in reaction to the government. And it was fashionable to name your junior common room, the place where you all go drinking and stuff, to name it the Mandela Room and things like that. So I survived all that left-wing indoctrination, and I hope and pray that my children do too. One of my greatest fears is that my kids might turn out to be card-carrying lefties or tofu-eating green activists. That would be the worst thing.
In 2009, James Delingpole published a book, Welcome to Obamaland. What is your perspective?
That is the Cassandra thing that I was talking about. I saw your future, America. I told you it didn't work. There was nothing you could do about it for those 4 years. But then what did you go and do? you went and voted the guy back in. I warned you that Obamacare was going to be a disaster for your economy, and so it is going to prove. I warned you about all the green measures that were going to destroy your economy. I mean, okay, you've been more or less semi-saved, at least, by the shale gas miracle, which had nothing to